Well, I'd like to welcome you folks to the workshop. You see the title of the workshop is Teaching Pro-Social Behavior to Antisocial Youth. I know you're all concerned about aggressive youngsters and what to do about them. So we'll be talking a lot about aggression and what to do about it. Unfortunately, as you know, far too often you'll do something to stop the aggressive behavior of a youngster in a school or other setting, and it works. But 20 minutes later, he's back doing it again, or she's back doing it again. So while we will talk a good deal about the aggression itself and what to do about it, we're going to talk even more about teaching the youngster alternatives, teaching pro-social behavior to antisocial youth, so that he or she knows what to do instead. The reason for doing that is that one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons they behave aggressively again and again and again is that they don't know what to do instead. So we're going to talk in this workshop about methods you can learn for teaching youngsters how to deal with difficult situations in non-aggressive ways. Not with the expectation that they'll use it all the time, but that they'll use it some of the time, okay? But whatever method you use with aggressive youngsters to change their behavior, you don't mail it to the youngster, you don't leave it on his or her desk, you deliver it as a person. So rather than starting the workshop by talking about the youngsters, we need to talk about you, okay? You are part of the intervention, okay? Working with aggressive youngsters is difficult, it's stressful, and there's a problem, especially for those of you in the audience who are teachers or youth care workers. And the problem has to do with the fact that, well, let's put it this way. Not everyone who's a pilot flies airplanes. Not everyone who's a plumber fixes plumbing, okay? So just because you have a certificate to do something doesn't mean you do it. But the number of teachers and youth care workers in America who are certified to be in their professions, who are not in the profession, is staggering. It's about 50%. In Texas and a few other states, it's 60%. Why? What is there about that? Well, there are several things. Sources of burnout in schools and delinquency centers. Now just take a scan of that. Dozen different qualities of working with aggressive kids in America today that make that type of work chronically stressful. Okay? And the burnout statistics, as I've indicated, as you can see on this next overhead, 1 of 3 junior high school teachers and 1 of 10 elementary school teachers experience burnout. Half of all teachers in the U.S. leave teaching profession within 7 years, and so on and so on. Okay? But let us be very clear that stress and burnout are not the same thing. Here's the typical definition of burnout that you find in the research literature. Emotional exhaustion, which is the stress dimension, depersonalization, which is the interpersonal dimension, and reduced personal accomplishment. What I'm trying to say to you is that it's not the stress per se that drives teachers and youth care workers out of their work. It's the fact that you're not reaching your professional goals. I live in an environment, in terms of my work, and I know many of you do, that's stressful, and many of us love it. We schedule it that way. I schedule my own work life up to my neck, and I like it that way. But when it comes in over my head, then I have a problem. The problem for teachers and youth care workers is not the stress per se, but that they went into those professions in order to accomplish certain educational goals, and they're not reaching it. So it's the combination of the stress and the failure to meet the expectations. So I want to open the workshop by saying something to you people about, first of all, the stress. Take care of yourselves. If we're going to work with aggressive kids, the wellness movement in America, meditation, relaxation, good use of leisure time, nutrition, if it applies to anyone, it applies to people who work with aggressive kids. The other quality has to do with how you set your aspiration level. The sad news is that we live in a country where aggression is taught, encouraged, rewarded. America loves aggression. It's a sad reality. So if you're going to work with aggressive kids, I say to you, don't be optimistic, don't be pessimistic, be realistic. Realistic means that in a society where aggression is at quite high levels, You can change the behavior of a reasonable minority of the kids. You and I, ladies and gentlemen, are in the business of small wins. I collect small wins. If you start your career with a class of chronically aggressive kids, a unit of chronically aggressive kids, and you say to a colleague, you know, I'm going to work today and I'm going to turn those kids around, those 25, 30 kids. At the end of 6 months, you'll be thinking about going into your uncle's shoe business because you set your aspiration unrealistically high in terms of where the technology of aggression intervention is. But if you said to a friend or colleague or a partner of yours, I can help 5 or 6 of these kids, you'll have a good semester, a good term, a good year. Okay? If we do this workshop again in a few years, instead of saying 5 or 6 kids, maybe the technology of aggression intervention will have advanced enough that I could say 7 or 8 kids. It's okay. I'm trying to say to you, it's okay. Aggression is not intractable. We don't have to be defeatist about it. We just shouldn't be over-optimistic. So set your aspirations so that you can help a reasonable minority of the kids. You'll have a good career. Okay? So let's talk about the kids and their aggression. Since we're talking about aggression, let's be sure that you and I are talking about the same thing. Aggression is typically defined as intentional, physical, or psychological injury to another person. Here's an example of the physical aspects of aggression. Now, there's nothing special about this list. You can make up your own list. It's just, 8, 10 different ways in which the physical aspects of aggression can manifest themselves. I like to put this list up, though, at the opening of a workshop to share with the audience a little bit about my own biases. And it has to do with the last 3 things on the list: smack, spank, and swat. My attitude, my belief about aggression and how to deal with it is that a child should never be hit, period. Now, I know that 90% of our kids in the United States are hit sometimes during their growing up years, and we'll talk later in the workshop about disciplining kids at home and so forth. I would like, for purposes of this workshop and defining aggression, to take the perspective of the kid. Smack, spank, and swat are terms you hear from adults, parents, teachers in states that permit corporal punishment, when you say to them, that's not appropriate behavior on your part to discipline a kid who's been aggressive by using aggression, and then the adult says, I wasn't aggressive, I just smacked him, spanked him, or swatted him. Let's take the kid's perspective. From the kid's perspective, these are aggression and these are inappropriate. And I think later in the workshop, when we start talking about extinction and timeout and response cost and the other nonviolent ways of punishing kids that have a strong research literature in support of their efficacy, all the more reason that using aggression to stop aggression will be seen as inappropriate. So these are some ways of concretizing the physical aspects of aggression, and here the psychological or verbal parts of the definition. This is from the work of Infante. Things we say to kids: character attacks, competence attacks, attacking what they look like, threatening them, swearing at them. What are these things? These are things that adults say to children or adolescents when the adolescent or child, in the eyes of the adult, has transgressed, has done something inappropriate. This becomes a very good time with this overhead for me to say to you, ask you, what business are we in? The business that I think we are in as youth care workers, as social workers, as teachers, is the same business that I think good parents are in. Teaching kids what is, in a sense, the single most important lesson in life, and that is behavior has consequences. Behavior has consequences. Behave appropriately, follow the rules of the community, the society, positive things happen. Kim, if you parked your car coming to the workshop today near a fire hydrant and you come out of the workshop and there's a ticket, I'm sorry there's a ticket there, but that kind of behavior has consequences. Christine, we're all going out for recess now, and because you cursed Mary Ann, you know, that behavior is not appropriate. You're going to have to stay here in Mr. Green's room working, and we'll be back in an hour. I hope you can join us tomorrow. I don't have to denigrate her, demean her, lower her self-esteem, cut her off at the knees. We're not in the business of making kids feel lousy about themselves, which these things are. We can discipline, we can communicate the rules of society, whether it's the larger community or the classroom or the unit in the delinquency center, in a way that gives the kid the message behavior has consequences without making the kid feel badly about himself, okay? So these are examples of the physical and now verbal or psychological aspects of aggression. Here's an aggressive kid. Why do I show you this? Not only because some of you learn better from pictures than words in this effort I'm trying to make to define what aggression is, but because I have to give you some bad news about aggression, and that is that unfortunately it's a very stable behavior. There's a half dozen long-term longitudinal studies making clear that the chronically aggressive child is quite likely to become a chronically aggressive adolescent, and unfortunately, in the studies one going 22 years, one going 30 years, chronically aggressive adult. If you correlate someone's IQ between age 6 and 16, you get a correlation of about 0.7, and unfortunately, for a great many youngsters, you'll get the same magnitude of correlation when we talk about their aggression levels. It's not inevitable. It's not inexorable. It doesn't have to be that way, but very often is that way because a certain spiral gets going where aggression feeds on aggression. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. So it's not only a difficult behavior to change, it's unfortunately a behavior that's quite stable, and as a matter of fact, it's sufficiently difficult to change that I began to wonder some years ago whether, for some kids, it's appropriate to think of aggression as an addiction. So I went through the literature on the more traditional addictions, smoking, eating, gambling, drug addiction, and I pulled out about 12 things that are true of those traditional addictions that are also true for aggression. And we don't have to go over all of these, but it's the general sort of meta point that so many things that are true of the traditional addictions also are true for aggression. It makes you wonder, is aggression, for at least some people, an addiction? The reason we need to wonder, since there are treatments, interventions that work to at least some extent for people who have addictions, maybe some of that could be also used for aggressive individuals. The one on this list that made me wonder about this in the first place is this one. Often experienced with a rush of pleasure or excitement. How many of you had the experience I'm going to share with you? You're debriefing a fight, and you happen to be talking to the perpetrator, and you're saying to the kid who did it, you know, Billy is down in the nurse's office now with a bloody towel over his nose, as you're talking about how Johnny broke the other kid's nose bone, and you look at the expression on Johnny's face. And you know, you're sort of squeamishly thinking about poor Billy who's bleeding down at the nurse's office, and Johnny's got a look on his face like he's in Happy Valley. He's getting off on it. I see several of you nodding your heads. You had the same experience. It's a high for many kids. So in many ways, it's a difficult behavior to change. Now, I say to you, difficult but not intractable. Visualize for a moment a nursery. Baby nursery. And in the nursery, there's a bunch of infants a day old. One of the infants is baby Rob, and Rob is a few hours old, and the other baby, 2 cribs away, 2 bassinets away, is baby Arnie. Okay, and you look in, and Rob is irritable, crying, twisting and turning, and baby Arnie is sleeping placidly. You come back a couple hours later, same thing, still temperamentally fussy and temperamentally placid. And the next day, the same thing. You would be correct in predicting, in general, that babies, even at that age, who enter the world with that high level of irritability and arousal are more likely to grow up to be aggressive than baby Arnie, who's sort of relaxed and spaced out. But wait a second. Baby Rob goes home to a family where when baby Rob misbehaves, Mama and Papa may take away privileges or reason with him but never hit him, and Rob's Mommy and Daddy never hit each other. Baby Arnie goes home to a very different kind of family where when baby Arnie transgresses, he gets smacked around and Mommy and Daddy smack each other around. Who do you think is more likely to grow up to be aggressive? Baby Arnie. So I'm trying to give you some sense of the relative contribution of nature and nurture, heredity and environment. We don't all leave the starting gate equal. Some people are more likely than others to learn to be aggressive, but in my reading of the literature, the social learning, the learning that takes place predominates, which is my way of saying to you, probably the most important fact underlying this workshop, aggression is primarily learned behavior. Big time, important fact. A lot of people, not just lay people, but professional people also have a different view. It's the view that aggression is kind of an instinct, an inborn energy, human nature, human character. A lot of people believe that. You find, I know there are some social workers in the audience, you'll find not uncommon in that and other professions. A husband's been hitting the wife, the therapist, counselor, says to the husband, that's got to stop. Next time you feel you need to be smacking Betty around, you take this nice little stick and you go over to the couch and beat the hell out of the couch instead. Blow off steam. It's a hydraulic notion, a ventilation notion. And the gym teacher in the middle school says to the chronically aggressive youngster, it's got to stop. Next time you go over to the punching bag and take it out on the punching bag. Okay? A very popular view that you can ventilate or blow off steam, and for those of you who subscribe to it, I hate to start with the bad news, it is a myth. Very popular. Now, you know in science we don't often say things that declaratively. We say it's probably true, it might be true, it looks like it's true, but there's so much evidence against this catharsis idea. If that husband is beating up the couch, boom, 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 and he looks at his watch and it's 10 after 6, he's used to having his supper at 6. Is he less likely to smack Betty because she didn't make supper? Because he's hitting the couch? No. If it feels good to hit the couch, if he's learning that aggression in that sense pays, he's more likely to hit her. And the kid at the punching bag, he's in the zone. He's good. The bag is flying, boom, boom, boom. And another kid comes over for a turn. Is he less likely to smack that? No, he's more likely. Okay? So now, obviously, if he's at the bag for an hour and he's exhausted, he's not only less likely to smack the other kid, he's less likely to do anything. That's not a catharsis idea. That's just a fatigue effect. I'm not talking about that. So aggression is primarily learned behavior, though we're not all equally likely to learn it. And it's the sort of foundation for this workshop. If it's learned, someone's teaching it. Where do people learn to be aggressive? Well, later in the workshop, we'll talk about how kids learn to be aggressive from other kids, and in some school districts from teachers. We'll certainly talk about the mass media, video and other similar mass media effects. But the beginning of learning aggression occurs at home. Coercive parenting begins with coercive parenting. What is coercive parenting? Well, you see it right there. It's a parenting style, frequent vague commands. Johnny, be a good boy. Betty, behave yourself. It's not specific enough in terms of directing the kids to specific concrete behaviors. Low levels of warmth and empathy. A strange combination of sometimes the kid is almost literally on a leash, and other times the same parent with the same kid has no idea where the kid is. Lax monitoring. Nattering, big part of it. Empty threats, pleading, a lot of nagging and scolding, threatening, yelling, some hitting. Parent starts it sometimes, responds to the kid's counterattacks and helps escalate the conflict, is inconsistent after the conflict begins. And perhaps most important, this last thing on the overhead, negative reinforcement of the child's coerciveness, which basically means the kid starting to learn to be coercive back finds out that it works. Kim says, no cookies. Johnny says, cookies. Kim says, sorry, darling. Johnny says, want cookie. And it escalates and escalates. And at the highest level of Johnny's attempt to coerce Mama into getting the cookies, Mama gives in. Rewarding not just Johnny's being coercive, but being very coercive. So the kid starts life in a sequence of coercive parenting that teaches the kid how to be aggressive. Now, I'm not just talking about the terrible twos. You and I know that it's sort of normative for kids to be kind of overly assertive around that age. I'm talking about something rather more intense. And as a matter of fact, if we had to label this kid at age 2, we'd call him a kind of temperamental kid. Now let's say he's 4 and he's starting to develop social needs, okay? And so he goes out and there sits Tricia, another 4-year-old, on a tricycle. Johnny doesn't have a tricycle. He wants a turn. But Johnny hasn't learned to go to Tricia and say, in a pro-socially skilled way, can I have a turn? Can I share? He's learned at home that the way you get your way is to be coercive, so he gives Tricia a push off a tricycle. Tricia's mama says, don't play with Johnny. He's not a nice boy. So Johnny goes over to Jay, who's kicking a soccer ball. And again, coercively, takes the ball. And Jay's papa says, don't play with Johnny. He's not a nice boy. Johnny goes over to the slide where 3 kids have queued up, waiting their turn. Johnny doesn't wait turns. Johnny sees, Johnny wants, Johnny takes. So he crashes the line. And once again, the kids, the peers, who might be a little bit of a counterweight to the coercive parenting, that is, kids from whom Johnny might learn some pro-social alternatives, are withdrawn from him. So he doesn't have positive models at home, he doesn't have it at play, and he starts to develop 2 qualities that unfortunately are going to track with him and do him poorly, service him poorly in the years ahead. One is social isolation and poor social skills. That's why this workshop is about the teaching of social skills, appropriate interpersonal behaviors, and a way of misperceiving the world called attribution of hostile intent. Now, John, I see you sitting there. Why are you looking at me? Well, John is looking at me because I'm giving a lecture, okay? But you know that if I was a kid, and I know you've seen these kids often, who is set to see the world as a threatening place, as a challenging place, as a place he's got to defend against, that ambiguous event, being looked at, variously called around the country stink eye, mad dogging, the 1,000-yard stare, and stare downs, is a first-class dissing, disrespecting, to which the kid, because he's attributing hostile intentions on parts of John, and especially if my peer group sees it, rather than ignore it, I got to respond. Now, you know, we may all have experiences in life where a colleague gives us a scowl. I would hope that if that happens, you either say to the colleague, what's happening, Harry? Is something troubling you? Or you say to yourself, Harry's having a bad hair day. I hope he's feeling... But rather than personalize it and have to react in an aggressive manner, and if I'm armed and I respond aggressively, I mean, you know, I'm leading up to the daily newspaper in many American cities. You know what I'm saying. I mean, why is it later in this workshop I'm going to have to spend 5 minutes discussing between class transitions in school, which you think is an irrelevant issue in the educational endeavor. Kids are simply going from room A to room B. Well, it's the time where that terrible crime can happen. Mary Ann and I can bump into each other. And if I'm attributing hostile intent, it becomes a big-time issue for educational management. So this kid, who we started calling him oppositional, now, I'm sorry, temperamental, now we're going to call him oppositional, goes to school. And he gets an actual label. Someone writes on an IEP, conduct disorder, or something like that. He still has social needs. The nice kids don't want to hang out with him. Why? Because his reputation precedes him. So he starts reaching out for other kids like himself. Affiliation with antisocial peer group. He reaches out for kids, I call them the pre-thugs, okay? And what happens, if anything, a further honing or development of his antisocial behaviors. He continues to have inadequate opportunity to develop social skills, and too often this youngster, now a conduct disordered youngster, goes on to have a label of juvenile delinquent or juvenile offender. So this is one way in which aggression is learned, the source being originally the things at home and then following in school. In a sense, this workshop has 2 introductions. We've now discussed the learning of aggression and where does it come from. Most people who do skills training work, you know there are many different methods out there, develop their methods based on social learning theory, and that's been important in our work also. But the reality is that we came to develop the skill streaming method that I want to teach you in a rather different way. And I want to share it with you because in many ways it speaks to a type of youngster who very often in particular needs social skills training and for whom we've developed an inadequate array of services. Now I'm talking about the low-income individual. I've had a great deal of interest in poor people in the course of my career. If you're poor in America, it has major implications, broad and deep. It has implications for your housing, for your nutrition, for your physical health, for your very mortality, and what happens if you develop emotional problems. Let's take an example. Sitting in the back row is Maura. Now, I don't know Maura. Let's assume for the moment that Maura and I are both neurotic. This is not a diagnosis, Maura, just picked you at random. We're neurotic in exactly the same ways. Same symptom pattern. In fact, the only difference between Maura and I, for purposes of this example, is that let us assume that socioeconomically she's middle class and I'm lower class. What difference does it make when she and I, independent of one another, knock on the door of almost any one of the almost 800 community mental health centers in the United States? I know some of you in this audience work in such centers. You see if you can back me up when I describe this developing scenario. Maura, middle class. Arnie, socioeconomically lower class. Maura is substantially more likely to be accepted as a patient than is the low-income individual. Same patterns, different destiny. If I'm accepted as a patient also, I'm going to spend a longer time on the waiting list before I get taken into treatment than is Maura. And when I get taken into treatment, it's more likely for me than it is for her that I'll be assigned to the least experienced staff member. Psychiatric resident, psychology intern, social work trainee. We go through a workup, a diagnostic workup, and yet at the other end of the workup, Maura and I get labeled differently. Same patterns, yet she gets called psychoneurotic, I get called something somewhat more pejorative, like character disorder. Maura, who I don't know, so I better make it up to her quickly for calling her neurotic, is an example of what William Schofield, in his very interesting 1964 book, and interestingly titled book also, Psychotherapy, The Purchase of Friendship, called the Yavis patient. This is America's favorite psychotherapy patient. If you do a survey of contemporary psychotherapists, even in this era where the cognitive behavioral approaches are so much on the ascendancy, you'll still get predominance of therapists saying that their favorite patient is the Yavis patient, young, attractive, verbal, intelligent, successful, and socioeconomically middle class. I always wondered why you needed psychotherapy if you had all those nice qualities, but in any event, favorite psychotherapy patient. In fact, so much the favorite that I've called the doctor, the counselor, the therapist, Dr. Yavis. Right? Now, Ms. Yavis and Dr. Yavis, interestingly, both share this great therapeutic myth that the best treatment there is, the real stuff, the right stuff, still, even in this era, is verbal insight-oriented psychodynamic therapy. He believes it, she believes it. She believes it so much that she comes to treatment with the type of expectancies that fit that therapy. Maura does, Ms. Yavis does. Participation expectancies. Maura expects to bring up new material, share her dynamics, look at her feelings. Dr. Yavis says, this is terrific. This is just what I want my patients to expect, participation expectancies. They form a good relationship as exemplified by the unbroken arrow, right here. And 2/3 of such patients improve, which is not bad. I know it sounds like I'm about to be critical. I'm being critical, it sounds like, of psychodynamic therapy. I'm not. As far as I'm concerned, every therapy is good for somebody. No therapy is good for everybody. Okay? So if Maura, if Ms. Yavis comes to treatment asking of the therapist solutions to kind of existential problems, I've lost my way, my purpose, my meaning in life, this is probably the therapy of choice. 2/3 improve, that's not a bad success rate at all. My interest has been, however, in a different type of client. I call this individual the Nanyevis individual. Not young, attractive, verbal, intelligent, successful, but physically ordinary, a little older, middle class or younger, adolescent or child, verbally reticent, intellectually average, vocationally marginal, socioeconomically lower class. Who is that person? Well, when I started my own work in my own career, I wasn't working with youngsters as I am now. I was working with adults in America's public mental hospitals. It was the era of deinstitutionalization was on its way. You remember that. There was, in the 1960s, approximately 550,000 adults in America's public mental hospitals. And then for fiscal, philosophical, therapeutic, and similar reasons, one day the doc would come down the hall and say, Michelle, you're out of here. Have a good life. And Michelle would be discharged. It was called the deinstitutionalization movement. Unfortunately, if Michelle was a typical patient at that time, she'd spent 10, 15 years in a mental hospital learning good patient skills, not good community functioning skills. Learning how to follow instructions from everybody and give instructions to nobody. Learning how to keep the chairs next to each other because it's easier to mop the floor that way than face to face where it's easier to talk. No wonder Michelle had trouble when she went out to the community and had to do things like go to a store and make a phone call and apply for a job. So we spent a half dozen years teaching hospital staff, using the skills training method I'm going to show you, how to teach community functioning skills to such individuals. What's the relevance of this to low-incomeness? Well, if you have a serious psychiatric disorder, certainly back then, and you need to go someplace for treatment, and you're poor, you go to a state hospital. If you're middle or upper class, you may go to a state hospital, or because you have more resources at your disposal, you may have private facilities, private therapists to do that. We were working in state hospitals. What about kids? What about aggressive kids and delinquent kids? Sherwin says to me, who are America's delinquents? I say, Sherwin, I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to show you. Okay? Let's go to a delinquency center anywhere USA. You pick the state. We go in the front door, we go out the back door. So what do you say? What does it look like to you? Well, Sherwin says, based on what I've seen, it looks like America's delinquents are kids of color, poor kids, immigrant kids. And I say, you know, Sherwin, it sure looks that way, but guess what? There's a half dozen studies of middle school and high school kids given under conditions of anonymity and confidentiality, making clear that about 85% of all youngsters engage at times in delinquent behavior. But if you're poor and you're a minority kid engaging in such behaviors, you're likely to wind up in the state system. If you commit the same level of infraction, but you have resources for private attorneys, plea bargaining, and so forth, you may wind up not incarcerated in those ways. So whether it's the mental health system or the criminal justice system, we have different systems according to social class. That's my point. And we were very concerned about the ways in which low-income individuals thus are underserved or unfairly served. I mean, here we have the example of Mr. Nanyevis. He comes to treatment not with the participation expectations that Ms. Yavis, Maura, had, but with guidance expectations. Tell me what to do. Dr. Yavis, this and this is wrong with my life, my marriage, my job. What should I do, says Mr. Nanyevis. Dr. Yavis says, I don't tell patients what to do. I'm here to help them explore the dynamics, their feelings, So what does Mr. Nanyevis do? He quits. He terminates. The relevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen, is that 50% of all clients who go to community mental health centers terminate in 1 or 2 sessions. If you work in one, you know that. Now, for some of them, that's all they needed, a little crisis intervention work. But for many of them, it was the realization they had gone to the wrong store. If you go to a local supermarket and you go to the delicatessen counter and you say to the person behind the counter, can I have a pound of ham, please? And they say, sorry, we don't have any ham. Do you want bologna? And you don't want bologna, you go to another store. That's what the Nanyevis client does when he quits because he's not getting what he wants. Unfortunately, the other delicatessen he goes to often is not very effective. It's his neighbor, his bartender, his clergyman. If he's lucky, he finds someone with a little common sense and empathy. But that's not a mental health system. That's just another way in which low-income individuals in our society are served poorly. Why is that? Well, one reason is illustrated by this gap. See the arrow that doesn't go between the middle-class teacher, counselor, therapist, and the low-income client, patient, or student? This gap? This gap is a cross-cultural gap. Now that may surprise you because I'm talking about social class. I mean, I know that this is a major era in the United States of diversity training, but think about the curriculum in your school or agency. Just what was the substance of it when someone was trying to help you become more cross-culturally sensitive? You learned about race, you learned about religion, you learned about nationality and so on, but you never learn about social class as a culture. Amy here earns $100,000 a year. This is just hypothetical, Amy. It's not a raise for you. Kim, sitting next to her, earns $20,000 a year. I ask each of them, what's your social class? They both say middle class. We live in a capitalist society where everyone is striving to improve themselves financially and yet has the need to always say, I'm just middle class. Okay? The reality is that there are qualities associated with social class that are important for the aggression realm, and we have to look at them. So one answer to the needs of low-income individuals is to include in our cross-cultural, multicultural, diversity training issues associated with social class in order to close this gap. Another solution is to skip over the gap altogether by going out and hiring non-Yavis helpers. These are people without formal credentials, without formal training, who come from the same background as the low-income client. They may have just a high school diploma, but they have a lot of common sense and empathy. Do you know who I'm talking about here? Back in the 60s, there was something called the Community Mental Health Movement, where there was a major hiring of such uncredentialed people. They were called teacher aides, paraprofessional therapists, neighborhood therapists, indigenous therapists. This is 30 years ago, more. Are these people worth anything? Are these people helpful at all? We don't have to guess. There's been all kinds of comparative research demonstrating, and you got to hold your breath on this one if you're busy earning a master's degree, because in fact, people without the formal credentials have been demonstrated to be as or more effective than the people with the credentials, which is a scary piece of findings for someone like myself who's in the training business. But it does teach us an awful lot about things that people learn maybe before they're even teenagers in terms of caring, empathy, common sense, and so forth. Now, if you're in a master's degree program, don't quit because it's relevant to whether or not you keep your job, but we should have added respect for people who can be non-Yavis helpers even though they don't have the formal training. But since the needs are such that that can't cover it all, we have to go beyond that. Another solution that some people have made use of is called the conformity prescription. Now, I call it that, and I'll share it with you, even though it's not a solution that I happen to like. Some people do. It's a solution that says that my method, your method, any method, is so good that it's for everybody. And if someone isn't benefiting from them, we're not going to change the method. We're going to acculturate, teach the person how to better use the method. It's like I sit down one day with Stephanie to play Monopoly. She's having trouble getting into the game. I don't assume there's something wrong with the game. It's played all over the world. I assume there's something wrong with Stephanie's understanding of the game. So I hold up the cover, we go over the rules, and once she understands it, we play the game. So there is a famous psychiatric clinic in America, fine clinic. If you go there as a patient candidate, you will spend 3 or 4 weeks not with the therapist, but with an intake worker in what's called the role induction interview, the anticipatory socialization role induction interview. Donna, I want to spend the next few weeks with you looking at videotapes of successful therapy. And you and I together will sort of dope out what that patient did to be successful so that you can try it when you meet with your therapist. Look, he's talked about this, didn't talk about that, cried here, sighed there, talk to, you got it? Good. Your therapist is Dr. Smith, room 4 down the hall. Have a good therapy. It may not surprise you when I tell you that the evidence shows that most conformity prescriptions have failed. If I'm a teacher, Rob and Christina are my 2 students. Now, I have a teaching method that Rob really learns well from, and it's my best method. When time comes to teach Christina, shall I give her less than my best? She doesn't happen to learn well from this. So I give her my best in a sort of spirit of being democratic, and she doesn't learn well. That's not being fair. I need to do instead what I call the reformity prescription. In the conformity prescription, we try to change the youngster to fit the method. In the reformity prescription, we change the method to fit the youngster. And good teachers do this all the time. Peggy is a special ed teacher, and she's good. She has some information to teach her class. Joyce is a bright young woman. Peggy knows that she can give Joyce the general principles involved in the lesson, and Joyce will figure out for herself the specifics of it. Patty's a little slower. Sorry, Patty, just the luck of where you're sitting. So Peggy knows that in teaching the same lesson to Patty, she better give the general principles and the specifics. John learns better pictorially. So Peggy knows that in delivering the same material to John, she better be more of an audiovisual teacher, changing the method to fit the kid. I think this was said best by a colleague of mine up in Ontario Institute for the Study of Education, who talks about how teachers, good teachers, radiate certain types of teaching environment. And kids have different channels of accessibility. And it's our job, if we want to be effective educators and change agents, to match what and how the teacher is sending with the kid's ability to receive. And I know you know this. It's been around, this idea of matching, for so long. It goes by different names: differential treatment, individualized instruction, prescriptive psychotherapy. That's what we're talking about here. And that's what we wanted to do many years ago in trying to develop a method that fit the needs of low-income youngsters, okay? That's really what happened with regard to skill streaming, and I want to describe it to you so that you'll understand quite how skill streaming came into being. Let's assume that I'm a papa. In first instance, I'm going to be a papa in a middle-class home, okay? I'm asserting to you folks that what goes on, and I'm asserting this based on some pretty substantial literature in developmental psychology and sociology, that what goes on in a middle-class home and what goes on in a low-income home differs in terms of the learning style developed in the youngster. It's not that one is better than another, they're just different. And if different learning styles are developing, and therapy or teaching is a learning experience, we have to tap into those different learning styles. Let me be specific. Let me give an example. We're going to be first in a middle-class home. I'm the papa. Shirley is my 8-year-old daughter. Shirley is my 4-year-old daughter. Rob is my 8-year-old son. Okay? I'm the papa, 4-year-old daughter, 8-year-old son. One day we're sitting around watching television. I hear a scream. I look up. Rob has pulled Shirley's hair. Not an impossible event in any home. What is likely to happen at that moment in a middle-class home? The first thing that's likely to happen is that I turn to Rob and I say to him, "Why did you do that? How come you did that? What made you do that? What is going on here?" Well, he gives me an answer. She kicked me, she turned the channel, whatever. That's what I get from him. But what he gets from me, and Rob gets this hundreds of times in his growing up years, look at your motivation. Look at the antecedents of your behavior. Look at what caused your behavior. So Rob developed some skill in discerning his motivations. And then I turn to him and I say, "Look at your sister. Look how she is. How do you think she feels?" I'm going to generously call that empathy now. Okay? How do you think she feels? Well, this causes Rob to unroll his antennae, aim them at Shirley, and based on her behavior, her tone of voice, her gestures, her posture, come up with some idea about how she's feeling. So he developed some skill in discerning other people's feelings. And then I say to him, "Look, son, you're all of 8 years old now. I expect you should be able to control that behavior." And again, I say this many, many times, and I'm still 3 times bigger than Rob, so he better pay attention. So Rob developed some skill in self-control. The list is actually longer, but this is basically the heart of it. Middle-class learning style, skill in discerning motivation, tuning in on feelings, valuing self-control, and so forth. Now, since I'm not that middle class, I then give Rob a smack. If I give him a smack, enough smacks, and he grows up neurotic, and now he's having trouble not with his sister, but with his spouse, and decides to go to therapy, first of all, who does he go to see? Dr. Davis. Good. I didn't want to start the whole workshop all over again. I'm glad you got that one. And what are the skills that Dr. Davis wants his patients to have to be in the 2/3 that improve? Well, son of a gun, here they are. Dr. Davis says to Rob, who's having marital problems, why did you marry her? How do you think she feels when you come home half cropped every Friday night? Can't you control that drinking behavior? And so on. You get what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? It's no mystery why 2/3 of middle-class patients improve. They bring with them to the therapy the skills required of that therapy. Let's reverse this scenario or replay it and be a low-income family. Shirley's my 4-year-old daughter, Rob's my 8-year-old son, and we're a low-income family this time. And we're sitting around watching TV. Rob pulls Shirley's hair. What's the low-income papa more likely to do at that moment? Smack him, right. Because in the low-income household, there tends to be more of a focus on consequences, on action. Doesn't mean there's no concern with feelings in low-income homes. Of course there is. But the focus on action or motor behavior is more substantial. And I say to Rob, son, you're a big boy now. If I see you do that again, I'm going to smack you twice as hard. Focus on external authority. So this introduction really comes down to this, doesn't it? If you grow up with the qualities in the first column and you go to an intervention whose success depends on that, you will do well. If you go to that same intervention but you come to it with qualities from the second column, you'll say, I'm in the wrong delicatessen. It's a good move. You go elsewhere. We can, however, take the qualities in the second column and build an approach that fits it. Okay? Tap into this is the reformity prescription, the learning style of the client. If these are individuals, for example, who are responsive to external authority, we will be the external authority. The method, called skill streaming, begins with a demonstration by the trainers. If Rob and I were the trainers, and you were a bunch of kids, whipping boys who get teased a lot, and we wanted to do skill streaming, we could say, listen, there's a lot of teasing going on in this school, and I know you guys have tried to deal with it a lot. Maybe we can learn from each other. That would be okay to do, but that's not what we do. Skill streaming is a didactic, pedagogic, psychoeducational teaching approach. It begins with Rob and I responding to the fact that so often these are youngsters who do respond to external authority by getting up and putting on a demonstration, a modeling display, a playlet of the skill responding to teasing. One of the many skills in the skill streaming curriculum. Since these are action-oriented youngsters, after Rob and I do the demonstration, rather than, what do you think of that? Let's discuss it. We want action. The behavioral rehearsal, the role play. Each youngster in turn gets up and role plays the skill as he or she could use it. The focus on consequences leads to performance feedback. That is, the rest of the group and the trainers let the kid know how well they did in their role play in terms of following the steps of the skill, in terms of comparing it to the way Rob and I did it in the modeling display. And then finally, and what probably is the most important part of this, we do things like homework assignments and other things I'll describe to help the skill transfer out of the training room, which is easy, to the outside, which is hard. Their relationships with parents, peers, and so forth. So that's what skill streaming is. Here it is on another overhead all by itself. And you see what it consists of. Modeling, which is the skill demonstration by the trainers, role-playing, the skill rehearsal by the youth, performance feedback from everyone in the group, including the trainers, and then a variety of things to help it both transfer to other settings and maintain over time. And I hope, ladies and gentlemen, as you look at this overhead, you're saying to yourself, I know that, because 99.9% of you not only know it, I'd bet anything you do it every day. The math teacher does it. when he or she puts a math problem on the board, shows the kids how to do it. Joyce, would you come up now and do this other problem? The basketball coach does it. Here's the way you shoot a foul shot. Sherwin, now would you come up and and after seeing Sherwin shoot the basket or Joyce solve the problem, that's the role play. What does the teacher or coach do? Performance feedback. Here's 30 more problems now as your homework. That's the general. Go to the line and take 25 more shots. Okay? So the method is basically the same method by which almost any content is taught, except here, instead of teaching math problems, shooting a basket, English issues, social studies, we're teaching social skills.